I've lived next to a cemetery for as long as I can remember, but it wasn't until I moved into my second floor apartment that I started noticing strange things happening. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as time went on, it became impossible to ignore. The most unsettling thing I experienced was the sight of black smoke moving through the hallways of my apartment. It would drift across the floor almost as if it had a mind of its own and disappear into thin air before I could even react. There were also the eerie sounds I'd hear in the dead of night. At first, I brushed them off as just the wind or the old building settling, but these sounds were different. It was the sound of someone crying, faint but unmistakable. I'd rush to my window only to see nothing. No one was there, but the sorrowful weeping echoed in the silence of the night, making my blood run cold. As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel the weight of something watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never truly alone in that apartment. The air seemed thick, heavy with an unseen presence, and it was as though the walls themselves were aware of my every move. It wasn't just the strange noises or the sight of that unsettling smoke. It was the feeling of being constantly observed, a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. The atmosphere in the apartment grew more oppressive with each passing night. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape the discomfort that settled over me. There was something terribly wrong about that place, something I couldn't understand, but I could feel it in my bones. The presence, whatever it was growing stronger, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something happened that would make me face the true horror lurking in the shadows. As time went on, the unease only grew stronger. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the feeling of something being wrong became undeniable. The strange occurrences weren't constant, but they always seemed to happen at the most unexpected moments, making me question if I was imagining it all or if there was truly something sinister happening around me. There were nights when I would lie in bed, trying to sleep, but the oppressive silence would be broken by the softest sound, footsteps in the hallway, faint but unmistakable. I'd sit up, straining to listen, but the noises would always stop before I could pinpoint where they came from. I'd get up to check, heart pounding in my chest, but when I opened the door, I'd find nothing. It was like the apartment was playing games with me, teasing me with these eerie sounds only to leave me in a state of confusion. The worst part was the constant feeling of being watched. It wasn't just in the dark corners of the apartment or the eerie sounds of crying I'd hear at night. It was the sensation of eyes on me, even when I was alone, walking around the apartment. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to see something standing there watching me. But every time, nothing. Just the quiet emptiness of the place, mocking my fear. I began to question my sanity. Was it all just my overactive imagination, or was something truly wrong with the apartment? Could it be that I was simply too scared to admit the possibility of something supernatural? The thought haunted me, and no matter how hard I tried to dismiss it, the feeling of dread never left. It was as if something or someone was waiting for me to acknowledge it, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to face the truth. After a long night at college, I was walking home, passing down the street next to the cemetery. It had always made me uneasy, especially at night, but tonight, something felt different, something far worse. As I walked, I began to hear the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it might be my imagination, the sound echoing through the empty street, but no, they were unmistakable. Heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to match my own pace, as if someone was following me, only a few feet behind. My heart began to race, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to ignore it, hoping that I was just overthinking things, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. Every time I quickened my pace, the footsteps quickened as well, getting closer and closer. It was like the person behind me was getting closer, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around and check. Eventually, the anxiety became too much. I couldn't keep pretending nothing was wrong. I stopped dead in my tracks, spun around quickly, and looked behind me, expecting to see someone standing there, ready to explain away the fear that was gripping me. But there was no one. The street was wide and empty, with no place for someone to hide or escape to. The footsteps had stopped, yet I could still feel a lingering presence, an oppressive weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. I stood there frozen, my mind racing. How could someone have gotten so close to me, so quietly? The street was long and open. There was no way for someone to just vanish like that, I searched every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing. The fear that had been building inside me suddenly hit its peak. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been imagining the footsteps, and whatever had been following me was still out there waiting. I stood there paralyzed, unable to process what had just happened. The footsteps had stopped, but the lingering sense of dread didn't. My heart raced, my breathing shallow and erratic. How had someone gotten so close to me without a sound? And more importantly, how had they vanished without a trace? There was no explanation, no logical reason for it. The street had been empty, wide, and devoid of any place to hide. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the footsteps. The more I thought about it, the more the panic set in. I felt like something was drawing nearer, something far worse than any person could be. It was as though the very air around me had changed, growing heavier, colder. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something was closing in, watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, as though invisible eyes were locked on me, and I had no idea how much time I had before whatever it was would make its move. Every rational thought I tried to cling to seemed to slip away. The more I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, the more I felt that cold, suffocating presence creeping closer. I began to fear that what I had experienced wasn't a human being at all, but something far darker, something supernatural that had been drawn to me. The idea that I was no longer in control of the situation, that I was at the mercy of something beyond explanation, terrified me beyond belief. I could feel the terror slowly consuming me, a dread I couldn't escape. The night, once so familiar and comforting, had become a nightmare. The street that led to my apartment now felt like a death trap. Whatever had followed me wasn't something I could outrun, and the thought that I might be dealing with a force beyond the realm of understanding was the most chilling thought of all. The fear that gripped me that night didn't just fade away. It stayed with me, a constant weight pressing on my chest. I knew that I could never walk down that street alone again, not after what had happened. The thought of returning to that place, of feeling that presence close by, was enough to make my heart race with terror. It wasn't just the footsteps I heard. It was the overwhelming certainty that something was hunting me, something that wasn't bound by the rules of the world I knew. I tried to tell myself that it was just an overactive imagination, but deep down, I knew the truth. What I had encountered wasn't something I could explain, and that realization haunted me. The idea that there was something out there, something that could track me in the darkness, was enough to keep me awake at night. The fear had invaded every part of my life, tainting every shadow with suspicion and every rustling sound with dread. I couldn't escape it. Even when I was far from that street, I could still feel its pull. The terror that had followed me was always lurking just beneath the surface, ready to resurface at the slightest trigger. My mind would wander back to that street, to the feeling of being watched, to the eerie silence that followed me when I turned to check if anyone was there. It felt like the terror had attached itself to me, a shadow that would never let go. The mystery of that night, the unanswered questions, gnawed at me. But the real nightmare was knowing that whatever I had felt back then was still out there. It wasn't just a one-time experience, it was a part of me now. And the idea that something out there in the shadows was still watching, still waiting, was something I couldn't shake. That terror, that feeling of being hunted would haunt me forever. My mother and I had just moved into a new house, and at first, everything seemed normal. But as the weeks went by, strange things started to happen. It wasn't anything too obvious at first, just small, unsettling moments that made us feel uneasy. We hadn't expected anything out of the ordinary, but that was before the new neighbors moved in. They had just settled into the house next door, and from the start, there was something off about them. We didn't see them much, but when we did, it was always brief. They were reserved, almost reclusive. They didn't speak to anyone, never really made eye contact, and seemed to prefer staying behind closed doors. It was like they were trying to avoid being noticed, but it wasn't just that. There was a strange energy about them, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. There was a certain stillness that surrounded their home, as though it was locked in time. The neighbors' odd behavior started to make me feel uncomfortable, but I didn't know why. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but it was so subtle that it was hard to pinpoint. Looking back, I think that feeling was a warning, a hint that something darker was coming. At the time, though, I thought I might just be imagining things. After all, I had no reason to believe they were anything more than just quiet people. But little did I know, the unsettling atmosphere around their house was only the beginning. Something far worse was waiting for us, and the strange behavior of the neighbors was just the first sign. As time passed, the strange occurrences inside the house became impossible to ignore. It started with small things, objects moving when no one was around. At first, it was just a chair, shifting ever so slightly in the corner of the room. I thought maybe I had just imagined it, or that it had somehow been moved by accident. But it kept happening, and each time the movement seemed more deliberate, as if someone or something was intentionally making it happen. One evening, I walked into the living room and found a chair turned completely around, facing the wall. I hadn't touched it. No one else had. My heart raced as I tried to convince myself that it could be some natural explanation, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Then, there were the other things. Books falling off shelves, objects being knocked over with no one there to explain it. The house, once a place of comfort, started to feel heavy, like it was closing in on us. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But as the incidents became more frequent, it became harder to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every creak of the floorboards, every sudden shift of furniture made my skin crawl. I couldn't escape the growing dread that hung in the air. The house, once so full of promise, now felt cursed. It was only a matter of time before something worse would happen, something far more sinister. I didn't know what was causing these strange events, but I began to fear that whatever it wasn't going to stop until it had us. One night, my uncle came to visit, bringing his daughter along on an electric scooter. They had come to see us for a while, and everything seemed normal at first. We chatted, laughed, and enjoyed each other's company. But as they were about to leave, something strange happened. The scooter's battery completely died, and my uncle, not wanting to deal with it in the dark, asked if he could leave it at our house for the night. He promised to pick it up the next day in his car. We agreed, not thinking twice about it, and left the scooter parked in the corner of the living room. It felt like just another normal night as my mom and I settled in for bed. But around 2:30 in the morning, we were abruptly awakened by a strange, unsettling sound. It was a loud, persistent noise, like a pipe bursting or something being violently smashed against the wall. Confused and terrified, we both rushed to the window to see if anything was wrong outside. But as we looked out, we noticed something that made our blood run cold. The electric scooter was on, its engine revving at full speed, slamming against the wall as if someone was riding it, even though there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest. How could this be? The scooter was parked, and no one had touched it. The sounds of the engine revving, and the way it relentlessly slammed into the wall made it impossible to ignore. We stood there, frozen in disbelief, watching the scooter speed up, almost as if it had a mind of its own. My mom quickly ran over to it, placing her hand on the scooter and began praying, her voice trembling. Gradually, the scooter began to slow down, eventually coming to a stop. The entire event left us shaken, unable to comprehend what had just happened. It was as if some unseen force had taken control of the scooter. We couldn't explain it, and the fear that clung to us in the hours that followed was almost unbearable. It felt like something, or someone, was trying to send us a message, but what? That night, around 2:30 a.m., my mom and I were suddenly woken up by a loud, unsettling sound. It was a noise that reminded me of a water pipe bursting, followed by something that sounded like it was being forcefully dragged across the floor. We both shot out of bed, hearts racing, trying to understand what was going on. The air was thick with tension, and I could already feel the unease building up. Without saying a word, we rushed to the source of the noise, the living room. When we stepped into the room, we were met with an image I can never forget. The electric scooter was turned on, its engine roaring as if someone was desperately trying to accelerate it, but no one was riding it. The scooter was pressing itself against the wall, its wheels spinning furiously, but it didn't move an inch. It was stuck, wedged in place, but still accelerating violently as if there was an invisible rider. I stood frozen, my eyes glued to the scene in front of me. How could this be happening? My mom, trembling with fear, quickly approached the scooter. Her face was pale, and I could see the terror in her eyes as she muttered prayers under her breath. She reached out, placing her hand on the handlebars, as if trying to stop whatever was causing this. The scooter kept revving, its engine roaring like it was alive, and I could hear it echoing throughout the house. The sound was deafening, like something unnatural was taking control. But then gradually, the speed slowed down, the scooter's engine quieted, and it came to a stop, as if whatever had been controlling it had suddenly let go. The room was deathly silent after that, but the fear still lingered, thick in the air. What had just happened? What had caused the scooter to come to life like that? My mom and I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too afraid to speak, too afraid to move. We couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had taken control of that scooter, something that didn't belong in this world. Even after everything had stopped, the dread we felt never fully left us. It was as if whatever had happened that night was only the beginning. After that terrifying event, my mom became deeply worried. She couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent had taken root in our home. The fear in her eyes was more intense than I'd ever seen. She made the decision that the only way to rid ourselves of whatever had been haunting us was to pray, to beg for protection, to plead for safety. So every night, we began a ritual of prayer, asking for divine intervention to cleanse our home from whatever dark forces had taken hold. We burned incense, sprinkled holy water, and my mom prayed with such intensity that I could feel the weight of her words in the air. Slowly, as the days passed, the strange occurrences began to stop. The eerie sounds faded away, and the objects that once moved on their own were still once more. It seemed like we had finally gained control of the situation, but the relief didn't last long. Even though the phenomena ceased, the fear never truly left. The house felt quieter now, but that silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating, as if something was still watching, waiting in the shadows. My mom tried to assure me that everything was over, that the prayers had worked, but I could never forget the feeling of the scooter revving on its own, or the unsettling sensation that something had been there with us, something we couldn't see but could feel. I often found myself looking over my shoulder, even in the safety of daylight, half expecting to hear that same engine roar in the dead of night. The fear of what had happened never truly went away. The house is quiet now, too quiet. The energy that once felt so oppressive has lifted, but the memory of that night hangs over us. I don't know if the prayers really worked or if something darker has just retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike again. What happened in that house was beyond explanation, and I'll never be able to fully understand it. But I do know one thing. The fear of the unknown, of something supernatural, is something that will stay with me forever.